everybody, and welcome to Real Houston's webinar on Texas policy and legislation. We're very glad that you're joining us today as we get informed and maybe a little bit of prognostication from this discussion. Today, leading the discussion as our moderator is Ryan Scott, who is Vice President of HBW Resources, and also I hoped he would say a proud board member of Real Houston. And our special guest today is Doug Lewin, who many of you may know from his Texas Energy and Power newsletter or from his podcast, Energy Capital. Oh, wait a minute. Did I get that right, Doug?
Yeah. You did.
Oh,
Perfect.
good
Thank
for
you.
me. As some of you may have heard me say before, I'm Camical, and I chair the board of Real Houston, and I'm also a subscriber of Doug's because it makes keeping up on Texas policy and legislation not a full-time job for me. And I let Doug do the hard work and just keep me informed. And also, if I want to see whatever's going on at a PUC meeting, Doug will blog it, and I don't have to sit around for everything. I can drop in and see what's been going on. So I recommend that you check it out. Doug does have some free content you can see, but I can tell you that the subscription I found it worthwhile for what it's worth. Today, Ryan and Doug will be discussing what's been going on so far with the Texas legislative session and in the policy arena. And they are open to taking questions. And if you could use the Q&A feature in Zoom, that would be the place to put your questions. And then as time permits, Ryan will be posing those questions to Doug. And I think with that, we're ready to kick it off. Ryan?
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much. And yes, I am a proud board member of Real Houston. Thanks for mentioning that. I want to set the stage here just a little bit and then pump Doug for as much information as we can. But I want to put this in context. So we are talking about the 89th legislative session in Texas, 89th legislature. So Texas has 140 days every 2 years to do its legislative business absent a special session. So that, 140 days is about 4.5 months. We're a little under 2 months in so far. So let's call it, we're a little less than halfway through, unless there's a special session. So that's the first thing I want to say. In my opinion, that means there is a lot of work to do in a very short amount of time. And it's usually compressed towards the end of the session, as you might expect, is when things really get moving. Another couple things I want to point out is on the Texas power demand side. You mind if I go through this, Doug, and cite some of these facts from ERCOT? Okay, so I'm going to go through this quickly. In August 2000, we're at 57.6 gigawatts. August 2010, 65.7. 2019, 74.8. In August 2024, that was 85.6. Those are all peak demand numbers.
And I think just to double click on that, like the real key thing there, right, is that up until 2021, 2022, we were 75 gigawatt peak. In 22, we hit 80. In 23, we hit 85. 24 was 85 again. So a 10 gigawatt peak demand growth over the space of just a couple of years is really extraordinary.
Absolutely. And the couple of things I would flag is one, the growth rate doubled. So it was 14% every 10 years. Between 19 and 24 is 14% over 5 years. And then you move forward another 5 years based on ERCOT's projections. This is from Pablo Vargas, ERCOT's CEO. We're expecting a 75% increase. So we can debate whether we believe that or not, but that's an extremely big jump.
Ryan, I want to double click on that one a little bit too. I'm dating myself here. For younger people, double clicks what you used to have to do to like go into something on the internet. So it just means diving deeper. But to double click on that a little bit more, we have also seen a big increase in the overall energy usage. So people talk about peak a lot. but part of what we're seeing is higher system utilization too. So we have had we had like a 4 or 5% increase in actual megawatt hours, right? So it's easier to talk about this in terms of terawatt hours. We're about we peaked at like, we're not peaked. We used over the course of the entire 2024 about 460 terawatt hours. That was up from about 440 the year before. So it's, like a 3 or 4% growth rate. The interesting thing is, I think ERCOT's projections are a little overheated. I don't think we're going to hit 150 by the end of the decade, but I do think we're probably going to see somewhere in that. And the chairman of the PUC said this in testimony of the House yesterday too, like somewhere in a 120 to 130 kind of a range by the end of the decade. And that is a growth rate of somewhere around 8-9%. You hear a lot that is unprecedented. It's actually not unprecedented in the post-World War II boom, particularly when air conditioning was going all over places like Houston. That's the last time we've seen 8 or 9% growth rates. And it is pretty extraordinary territory to be in. And that's cutting ERCOT's projections by a third to a half. We're still looking at growth rates like the 1950s when air conditioning was just starting to come into vogue.
And you're talking about 8 or 9% year over year, right, Doug? Not over.
Yeah. 8 to 9% compound annual growth rate, right? CAGR. Yeah, exactly.
And everything we've been discussing previously was in a 5 or a 10-year chunk. So that 8 or 9% is significant.
Yeah, we've been growing like 2% over the last like quarter century, even going back further into the 80s and 90s, 2-3%.
So I mean, what I'm trying to highlight here, and I think we made the point, but the growth is pretty extraordinary.
Yep.
I've got a few more stats to share that I think highlight where that growth is coming from. I think most of it is going to be pretty intuitive, but it's interesting to hear. I found it interesting anyway. So Texas, 1,300 new residents a day, about 500,000 people a year. So that's the residential growth. I think as Doug pointed out, the average person, each of those people is using more energy than they used to, and we expect that number to grow. Some of the big drivers of that, EVs, AI, data centers, crypto, things like that. So a lot of the buzzwords and acronyms we've been talking about quite a bit over the past several years. But if you follow announcements like Stargate, if you think about, data centers springing up west of San Antonio, south of Dallas, et cetera, you think about the electricity usage rates in the Permian for electrification of oil and gas. There's just a huge demand that's coming around. So the legislature is very focused on making sure that there is enough electricity to go around. How they get there is up for debate, but I did want to just kind of dive into a couple of the bills. So there's a big one that just dropped on nuclear earlier today. That's HB 14. We might talk about that a little bit if we have time. There's a large load transmission bill called SB 6. That's probably, I think, the biggest show in Austin, at least in the energy world, for this session. And then we have a couple that are focused on renewables, which I'm sure the folks on this call would like to hear more about. So do you want to start with SB 819, Doug, and just give a little background on that and some prognostications, as Kay mentioned?
Sure. I will probably stay away from prognostication because if you follow the legislature at all, like making any sort of predictions is a fool's errand at best. Let me come back to 819 in a second. I want to double click a little further on a couple of the things you said on load growth. Data centers obviously are kind of the headline item. I think people should not take their eye off the ball of industrial electrification. You mentioned this in terms of oil and gas, but it obviously goes even beyond oil and gas. We're seeing a lot of particularly low heat industrials. And this is obviously a Houston kind of oriented call. And by the way, thanks so much, Kay, for doing this. And thanks for your leadership with the Renewable Energy Alliance in Houston. What a great organization. And thanks to everybody for being here today. But we are seeing that in Houston. We are seeing significant load growth, not as much from data centers in the Houston area, right? That's kind of more of a Dallas and West Texas phenomenon. Not that there's not some along the Gulf Coast too, but the industrial electrification is already driving load growth. Kay mentioned the Energy Capital podcast. The very first episode I did was with Commissioner McAdams just after he had left the PUC. And I asked him kind of what was something you learned following, post Uri, or something that kind of surprised you. He was the first commissioner appointed after Winter Storm Uri. And he said, I was surprised at the degree to which industrial electrification had already begun. There were already large loads that had begun to electrify back then in 21, and that trend has not abated. On the residential side, we're actually not seeing that much growth. Obviously, growth in the state of people moving here, new homes being built, and things like that. But as far as energy, even when you don't population adjust it, it's not growing that much. And I attribute that to, if people may want to put things in the chat who have other ideas, and I'm always open to people's ideas on this. It might be, not exactly an empirical matter. Everybody can have kind of their own theories on this, but I think at least part of it, it's safe to say, is coming from energy efficiency, and particularly from codes and standards, right? Just things like, refrigerators using much less power than they used to, TVs and electronics, air conditioning being the really big one. But we are seeing increased peaks, right? We are seeing, like, the summer of 2023, when it basically tied 2011 for the hottest summer ever. We did see an increased peak, but on the residential side, we actually aren't seeing more megawatt hours, more megawatts, not more megawatt hours. That's coming largely from the industrial sector. So that's actually, I think, a really good, bear with me, you'll see why. I think that's a good transition to SB 819, is that with this growth that we're seeing, it is going to be extremely important that we continue to develop as many different energy sources basically as we can. And because there is such a constraint right now in the gas system, particularly trying to get a gas turbine. Latitude Media had an article on this just last week. Heat Map News had one that they called the gas turbine crisis. I highly recommend people read those articles. If you today place an order for a gas turbine, very wildly optimistically, maybe 2029, 2030, more realistic 2031, 2032. NRG made a big announcement that they were getting 5 gigawatts from GE Vernova worth of gas turbines. One of those in 2029, 3 or 4 of those gigawatts, 3.5, something like that, in 2032. Now, you're in this context of rapidly rising demand, and you can't get gas turbines till the 2030s. We're in this weird world. Remember, those of you who are as old as me will remember Bill Clinton and others 20 years, 30 years ago talking about, gas being a bridge to renewables. Now renewables are a bridge to gas, which is kind of amazing. Renewables, and importantly, storage, right? Particularly solar and storage. 75% of what we put on the grid the last 3 years, over 30 gigawatts of solar and storage in just the last 3 to 4 years. SB 819 would put in place the tightest, most restrictive permitting system in the United States. You could argue that Ohio or some other places have, similar, but it would be right up there among the most restrictive in the United States. It absolutely would, if not completely stop renewable energy, at least significantly slow it down, probably throttle, half to 3/4, if not even higher a percentage of renewable development. And that would really be extremely harmful to the Texas economy, because basically what would happen is you would have to slow economic growth because you just can't get gas turbines till 2030. So it would be a real cell phone, kind of an own goal, Texas really kind of cutting off its nose to spite its face. And there was a similar bill last session. It passed the Senate, did not pass the House. Hopefully it doesn't pass either chamber, because it would really be really harmful for the Texas economy, in my view.
Yeah, and I think you, I'm guessing you went about as far as you'd be willing to prognosticate on the fate of that particular bill. I mean, I've heard it said before that if it passed the Senate previously, it will probably pass the Senate again. And the question is what happens in the other.
I mean, maybe, like, I'm not going to make any predictions. I would hope that over the last 2 years, the Senate has seen the numbers and understood that solar and storage, not only important for economic growth, look at the last couple summers we've had, right? I mean, the PUC chair, Thomas Gleason, has said publicly on many occasions, solar and storage were determinative to avoiding outages over the summer. I mean, why would you want to, curtail, like slow down, throttle, just basically effectively stop and kneecap an industry that is, perfectly suited to the summertime heat? It was as recently as 2019, Ryan, we had several, I believe it was two, it might have actually been three energy emergencies in August 2019. And when did they declare those emergencies? They were at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, right?
Hmm.
That is no longer a problem because we have so much solar that at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, prices are on the floor. And now you have storage coming into the system in a major way, doubling in 2024 from 5 gigawatts all the way up to 10 gigawatts. And now storage making a big difference during the hour or two where demand is still elevated as the sun is going down. I just can't imagine the Senate. I mean, I can imagine it. I can certainly imagine it. It doesn't make any sense to me why the Senate would want to stop that from happening. It just seems absolutely crazy to me. But who knows? And the House obviously is a very different body than it was 2 years ago. I am going to stay far away from making any predictions.
I think it's worth mentioning some of the details in 819. So some of the provisions we're talking about in SB 819, they are, additional EIS requirements, environmental impact statements that would be administered by Texas Parks and Wildlife. Texas Parks and Wildlife does not currently have a function or staff to administer an EIS unless something has changed very recently. So I think you could see how that'd be problematic. There would be a need to budget for that. There'd be a need to hire those folks, and also, if they're not completely qualified, train them up. There's also pretty draconian noticing requirements. The numbers are, several miles from the border of the projects. I think the typical number you see on noticing requirements around the country is, from a half mile to 2 miles. I think this extends out to 5 miles, Doug. I don't know if you recall the exact number, but
I
it's
think
a
there's
big number.
actually, yeah, I may be getting it confused with 624, but I believe there's at least some kind of a notice provision that's like 25 miles in there. I'd have to go
Yeah,
back and check that.
okay.
But it's draconian. I mean, it really is. At a certain point, like the details of this, like it's just something that is clearly just meant to kneecap an industry. I really don't think it's trying to solve any problem. I think if there was an intent to really, like, obviously there are best practices in development and things like that that could be put into place that are, but this is not that. This is just a bill that's meant to really directly harm an industry that has delivered a lot of benefit for the state.
Yeah, and I think this is the third time. This is the third iteration of this bill. So we saw it in 23 and 21. And I said this before, I think I mentioned this to you, Doug. One of the reasons it slowed down in 23 was because of the drama between the chambers and with the attorney general and the speaker and lieutenant governor. So, I think it's going to be important for folks, especially if you are employed in the renewable energy industry or you're a fan of it for some other reason. This is a really good time to dial up your representative, your senator, and have a conversation and let them know that you in fact are employed in this industry. I think they need to hear that as much as possible.
Yeah, 1,000%. And I'll also, just one more thing on this, Ryan. I would encourage folks to read the article that the Texas Tribune had today, written by Kayla Guo. It's really, really well done. And she highlighted in there how much key members of the legislature have development in their districts that are delivering hundreds of millions, in some cases billions of dollars of payments to local governments and also to landowners. That's a whole nother piece of this. I've talked about summer reliability. I've talked about meeting demand growth, but don't forget that there are a lot of folks with farms and ranches in the state. John Davis, former legislator, former Republican chairman in the House, is one of these folks who has 7 wind turbines on his land out in Menard County. And but for those wind turbines, he says he would not have been able to keep the land in his family. He's a 4th generation Texan. It's going to go to a 5th generation to his kids. And he would not have been able to keep it, he says, without those lease payments. That is not an uncommon story in this state. So let's not neglect that aspect of it too. And a lot of the folks that will be making decisions around that bill, a lot of the landowners in their districts would be harmed by Senate Bill 819.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a fundamental kind of property rights discussion to be had around these projects, right? So it's certainly not the leaseholder who is complaining about the project. It's almost always folks who don't actually own the property. And if
and I wrote about that too, and I wrote an article to Texas Energy and Power newsletter called "A Time for Choosing," and I have a Ronald Reagan quote in there about like what good is your private property ownership if the government can tell you what to do with your land. I'm obviously paraphrasing. Ronald Reagan said it a lot better than I did, but I would encourage folks to go and look at that. And the bill, I encourage folks to look at the bill too. It actually has in there in the exercise of the police power of the state, which is a pretty remarkable phrase to put into a bill by a conservative Republican.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for flagging that. Okay, there's one other bill that it seems to be at this point. So I think we have about a week left. Folks can still file legislation, so we're near that deadline. But the other one that I'm aware of currently is, let's see, Senate Bill 714. What is worth talking about with that legislation, Doug? Anything to flag for this group?
Oh God, which one is that? Is that the firming? That's the firming bill, I think.
Yeah,
Is
and
that
this
what
it
that is?
addresses IRA. Yeah, it addresses IRA funding, and I think it
Oh,
creates a bit of a quagmire in terms of understanding where electrons come from, right?
well, look, and this is again, like this is a point you could make about 819, about 714. Like, okay, if you're gonna do that, so on 819, by the way, it's entirely focused on renewables, right? If you're going to have notice for 5 or 25 or whatever the number is miles, shouldn't you do the same thing for oil and gas, right? But that's not in there, right? Shouldn't you do the same thing for a coal ash retention pond? Like, shouldn't people within 5 to 25 miles, like, which do you think is more harmful, a solar panel or a coal ash retention pond that has arsenic, selenium, and mercury in it, right? But we have no such requirements for notice that far out for those kinds of facilities. Similar to 714, if what you want to do, if that's the bill I'm thinking of, the way you put it is like, yeah, I think what they think they're trying to do there is like somehow counteract the federal subsidies. Let's not pretend like oil and gas is not a heavily subsidized industry. It has been heavily subsidized for a century at this point. Intangible drilling costs went into place in the 1910s. There are studies, and I can point people to it. You email me afterwards. There's like peer-reviewed journal articles about this that surveyed the industry, and something like 50 to 60, even as high as 70% of profits are realized through these intangible drilling costs, because you're able to basically like write off all of the costs of your drilling ahead of time. It's a massive subsidy, a huge subsidy, and that doesn't get into the oil depletion allowance. I mean, there's so many different incentives and subsidies through the tax code for all kinds of energy. So what I would encourage folks to do is, if they want to pass a bill like that, if you're going to take away the subsidies for wind and solar, take them away for oil and gas too. And then we'll all pay 2 to 3 times as much for energy. And let's see how people like that. They're not going to like it at all. We subsidize every kind of energy. You talked about House Bill. You mentioned, I think House Bill 14 just dropped. Nuclear is the most subsidized form of energy, right? Nobody builds a nuclear plant without government support. So if we want to pretend like wind and solar are the only forms of energy getting subsidies, I mean, that's their right. They're legislators, they're elected officials. They can do it, but it's a joke. It's ridiculous. Every form of energy is subsidized. So let's level the playing field, and let's counteract in Texas all of the federal tax subsidies for oil and gas too. And you start to see, of course, that's absurd. I'm not saying we should do that. We shouldn't. We subsidize energy because energy is essential for life and economic activity. And we know that there's a public good to having at least somewhat low cost power. And, if legislators want to make the cost of power higher for their constituents, have at it. That seems crazy to me.
Yeah, I think that's right, Doug. And I think it would be a dramatic departure from the environment that was ushered in by Governor Bush and, in many ways championed by Governor Perry to make sure that we built as much wind as we possibly could. Regulating an industry to death to me, doesn't seem very Texan.
And Ryan, I really appreciate you saying that. And because I do want to make sure we don't give into negativity bias here. We've talked about bills that are problematic, and obviously there's legislators carrying those that I don't think are looking at this right. Look, this the beauty of living in a democracy. Everybody gets to express themselves and say what they believe, and they're obviously entitled to their beliefs. I disagree with it. I would point out, though, that I think I don't know what the number is. I don't know if it's a majority or a large minority, but I would say most legislators of both parties fit more into this all of the above kind of mode. Yes, they want nuclear. Yes, they want more natural gas, but they also appreciate that wind and solar are delivering huge benefits to our state, both economically and in terms of grid reliability, storage as well, really starting to contribute, not starting to, is now, reached 10% of our demand yesterday, all-time record. So batteries are now fully on the scene and are only going to go up from there. So I think I hope, I'm not sure of this, but I hope that that's a majority position, and that there are some outliers that just really have an animus towards wind and solar, and that's their right. I just don't think it's a majority position. Certainly hope it's not a majority position.
Yeah, it might be. Hopefully, it's a somewhat silent majority that we can potentially get to speak up a little more
Right.
vehemently on behalf of these sources. Yeah. Do you happen to know? I mean, do you happen to know, Doug? I don't know the answer to this. The number I've heard on batteries is the PUC is discussing requirements on resiliency that would cause any project to have up to 4 hours of battery backup as a minimum.
No, I don't. I'm not sure I know exactly what you're talking about. They are developing really at ERCOT, but the PUC obviously is deeply involved, what's called the Dispatchable Reliability Reserve Service. And that's a new reserve that went into House. It was in House Bill 1500. And that is a 4-hour duration reserve. And there was at the beginning talk of excluding batteries. There's still some talk of that. But again, I think at the end of the day, cooler heads are going to prevail, and we're going to, again, invoked Governor Bush. Like for the last 25 years, what has characterized the Texas market is competition. And I don't think we should be creating any ancillary service or any part of the market whatsoever that excludes some sources. Like the more competition you have, the better. I think we need a more competitive market, not less. I think we ought to be getting more demand side resources into the market so that it's actually more competitive. I think that's what you're referring to, but correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's right. That's right. How do you feel about shifting a little bit towards SB 6 and the point of that legislation and kind of some of the
For sure.
some of the knock-on effects there?
Yep.
So SB 6 is, I mean, you have it teed up. Do you want to go ahead and lay it out?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so SB 6, basically this is a bill that the way I would characterize it, and I encourage folks to go look at the bill. It's only 9 pages or so. It'll be different by the time it's done, for sure. But in my view, it does two main things. It does more than this, but these are sort of the two main things it does. One is it's kind of dealing with what do we want to require? What is we in the broadest sense, what does the state of Texas want to require of large loads? It's I think a way, hopefully this is kind of the way it continues to develop. We're not saying no to large loads, right? A lot of states and regions in the country and around the world are just saying, no, we can't take this. Don't come here. That's not really in the Texas ethos, right? We've got this open for business kind of mantra, and I've had this for a long, long time. So I think what the bill is trying to do is say, yes, if, right? Yes, under these circumstances. Can you sign a power purchase agreement and bring some power with you as you come onto the grid? Can you bring backup power to your site so that if the grid is getting overloaded, if there's a big winter storm coming, we can see that you have the ability to disconnect for some period of, not disconnect, but to power your own operations with on-site power for some period of time. That's sort of one piece of it. The other piece of it, equally important, it's 1A, 1B. I could actually argue the second piece should be even above this, is how do we pay for the transmission system? Because right now we have this system where we can get into the particulars if folks want to, maybe in the Q&A section, but there's a system that's called for coincident peak. I can explain it later if people want, but the thing to know is if you're a large user, you can avoid most, or in some extreme cases, even all of your transmission charges for the next year by reducing your use during the four peak periods in June, July, August, September. As we go forward and these larger and larger loads are coming onto the system, it is going to be important, really critical, that there is a more equitable distribution of the charges. And to put this in perspective, over the last 4 years, industrial rates are basically flat. They've actually gone up about 1% to 2% over 4 years. So nowhere near the rate of inflation, right? Residential consumers have seen their bills go up by about 25% over the last 4 years. So we've got to do something to bring this back into balance. And in fairness, a lot of the data centers that want to come to Texas are saying, sometimes quite loudly, not always, but in some cases quite loudly, we're willing to pay more, right? I mean, if you're a big AI data center, you are putting a lot of money into buying chips and a lot of money into R&D and a lot of money into personnel. Your cost, and this is in Nat Bullard's great annual presentation that he does, came out in January, and he's got this great slide where he shows like of an AI data center, less than 5% of the cost of the AI data center is the power that goes to it. They're willing, but if you don't have power, you spent the other 95%, like you got nothing if you don't have power, right? So I think there's a willingness to pay there. And so I think there's a question as to how do we allocate those costs. So those are, I think, the two very related things that bill is trying to do. One, figure out, yes, under what conditions, and as part of that, sort of how do we allocate the cost for the transmission system. And Ryan, I think it's worth pointing out, like we're getting ready to embark on a pretty big build out of the transmission system, which I support, I think is desperately needed. We need infrastructure. We need extra high voltage lines, and they're not cheap. So I think we're going to need data centers to pay a significant portion of the cost of that.
And so there are a couple of, so thanks for that, Doug. I appreciate that. And I think that I want to underscore the point that you made. You know, the increase in cost for transmission for residential customers has gone up 25% in 4 years. It's kind of it's a very populist, but I think a correct thing to say. You know, if those are the rates we're seeing for the average Texan, and industry is only paying 1% to 2%, something's out of balance here. And I think those are exactly the arguments you will hear from folks like Senator Shortner, who was working on the grid resiliency joint task force between the House and the Senate. So I do appreciate those efforts for that reason. But the details is where it's going to get messy and frankly, I think a little bit difficult to forecast. But I think a lot of residential customers, and if you're listening to this here in Texas, you may have seen your distribution charges close to 50% of your entire bill, which is pretty shocking for a lot of folks. So I think that the grid is under a lot of pressure, and I think when we start talking about electrifying the Permian Basin, making sure we alleviate the bottlenecks from West Texas to the population centers. I think that is a huge part of what this bill contemplates. And I think one of the really big questions the bill raises and has to really answer is who will pay? Who will pay for the electrification? And the numbers are pretty staggering. And this is based on my conversation with you earlier in the week, but we're talking about the Permian portion alone, 13 billion approximately. And if we're talking about the entire state, it's over 30. So do you want to talk a little bit about that and some of the implications of getting that transmission up and running, steel on the ground, so to speak, is what we like to say?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the implications, that's a lot of money, right? There's no other way to say it. It's a lot of money, but you get what you pay for it. If we want a modern electricity grid and we want higher reliability and we want the ability for the state to continue to grow, we're going to need it. I was really struck by Senator Nichols' comments at the Business and Commerce Committee hearing when they were talking about building extra high voltage. And he told the story that he's been in the manufacturing business. And when he built his manufacturing plant, he said, all my electrical guys, as he put it, said, hey, put the higher voltage in at your manufacturing plant. You're going to need this higher voltage. And he was like, it's more expensive. I'm not going to do that. And he said, I found myself in the very next year needing to upgrade equipment, which was more expensive. And then he said, I had to upgrade it again a year or two after that. And he said, I would rather, I'm of course paraphrasing all of this, go back and watch his comments, but the basic tenor of what he said was, I'm in favor of us making this bigger investment. And by the way, the difference between the lower voltage at 345 and the 765 is like 6-7%. And we don't actually, there's actually a workshop happening literally tomorrow. If folks are in the industry, if you have anything to do with transmission or anything to do with power, you might want to tune in, because they're going to get into what's the supply chain, what's the cost differential and all that. But according to ERCOT's estimates, it's something like a 7% difference or something like that. So it's not nothing. That 7% is a few $billions, but to get that 765 kilovolt, which we have none of in Texas right now. And just one last thing on this, Ryan, there's a lot of discussion around like supply chain and can we even get these? I think the irony of the situation is, if we slow it down, and Chairman Schwartner filed a bill, I wouldn't say that his bill necessarily slows it down, but it says do a study of the extra high voltage. If the requirement is, and I'm not saying that that's what's in this bill, but if this is where it goes, that they say slow it down and study 765, the irony of the situation is, just like if you didn't order a gas turbine last year, now you're waiting several years longer, the same thing is going to start happening with 765. We're not the only place in the country or the world that sees this rapidly rising demand. As a matter of fact, globally, the International Energy Agency is saying, we're in the age of electrification, and there's going to be all this rapid demand growth around the world, 4 or 5% global energy growth, and only 10% of that is data centers. A lot of the rest of the world is electrifying because people are just beginning to get access to electricity, partly because solar is so cheap, is what we're seeing in a lot of Asia and Africa and Latin America, as a lot of places getting electrified. We're going to start seeing a big demand all over the place for 765. And if they don't move quickly, there's a real risk that we will get left behind.
Do you think there's something that that ERCOT could do in order to alleviate the supply chain issue?
Well, I'm not sure there is a supply chain issue yet. Like, that's the thing. And we'll see what happens in this workshop tomorrow. I think if from everything I've heard, and Commissioner Glotfelty, when he was still a commissioner, he asked this at an ERCOT meeting, or he brought this up at an ERCOT board meeting. He said he used to work in transmission. He had a DOE's Office of Electricity. He's got great contacts. And he said, I reached out. I think he even named the manufacturer in that meeting. I can't remember who he named. He said, I reached out to a couple of manufacturers, and they've all told me there's no longer wait for 765 than there is for 345. You're going to wait for anything for a while. And by the way, hard to not mention the tariffs here, right? Like that 30 billion could very easily become 40, 45 billion, given that most of this equipment it's a global market, and most of this equipment's coming from other places. So, and that, by the way, is true of solar panels, of gas turbines, of components that go into nuclear plants, transmission, like everything's about to get a lot more expensive if there's 25% tariffs in place. And as a matter of fact, Pablo Vegas, the ERCOT CEO, did say this to the PUC just a couple of weeks ago. He said, tariffs could cause prices to go quite a bit higher and cause delays. I can't remember if he was speaking specifically to transmission or just kind of in general. Transformers, all kinds of different things on the electric grid. It's all a global market. So yeah, I'm not sure there's anything they could do to really speed it up other than move expeditiously and get this build out underway. I don't think there's any doubt that we need it.
Can we stay on ERCOT for a minute? It's not something we discussed earlier in the week, but since we're on the topic,
you're asking the questions. We'll do whatever you want, man.
So it seems like ERCOT. So obviously there was a huge shake up with ERCOT post Winter Storm Uri. A lot of new faces, and it seems like a lot of the load forecasting has kind of been moved out towards the service providers rather than inside of ERCOT. So they're relying on information external to their operation, and it seems like it seems like a good thing to do in many ways, but it's also difficult to verify the data. So I'm just curious if you have an opinion on that situation overall, and if it's better or worse for consumers.
Well, so there was actually the change in load growth really came from House Bill 5066, which passed last session, and it said ERCOT needed to start considering what the transmission and distribution utilities were getting as far as interconnection requests, and that's really where the queue and the projections and the long-term system assessment and the regional transmission plan and all these kinds of things really started to balloon. But yes, they are taking more data in from the transmission distribution utilities. That is also a piece of Senate Bill 6. I think we'll see a fix, whether or not it's the right fix or not. Like you said, there's a lot of details to that bill, but there is a provision in Senate Bill 6, the one we were talking about earlier, that says ERCOT, and it's something along the lines of like they need to, the large loads need to disclose to ERCOT if they have put another request in another jurisdiction, so that they can know. Um, I don't know. I will say this, Ryan. It is incredibly difficult to know how much of this is real and how much is not. I think a lot of it is real. I think whether all, what percentage of it, who knows? I think what is important is to know that there has already been significant load growth, right? 4 or 5% just last year. The Dallas Federal Reserve at their annual employment outlook last month put out this slide that shows US load growth, which is up just a little bit. And then they laid a Texas line over the top of that. And there's a big gap between Texas and the United States as far as load growth. We are already seeing load growth from Bitcoin mining, from industrial electrification, from heat, by the way, from the heat outside, air conditioning load, right? 2023 was hot. I know this will, rub some people the wrong way, but I'll say it anyway. Like, it is getting hotter, and that does drive load up. It's one of the reasons why we need to depoliticize the whole discussion around global heating, because it affects load growth. So you see in the Fed Reserve's chart, there's like this huge spike in 2023. There's a gap across all the years, but there's a bigger spike in 2023. So when you get heat waves like that, which we're going to get more of, you see load as well. So I think the fundamental point is we're going to see load growth. We don't know exactly how much, but part of it is we're Texas. We should be welcoming this economic activity. Having AI data centers in the United States is a national security imperative. We need them. And there are very few places in the United States they can go. Texas has this dynamic free market with a lot of competition, with 44 gigawatts of additional supply coming into the system in the last 4 years, 13 and a half gigawatts in the last 11 months. No place can hold a candle to that. If anybody's going to be able to accommodate this, it's us. And this is where, just to kind of bring this back full circle, and I know you probably have another question or two before we get to Q&A, but like, I think this kind of brings it full circle, is like the legislature, and this is what that article, A Time for Choosing, I wrote, was really about. What I meant by a time for choosing was the legislature only has, like you led this off saying, there's only 140 days, right? 50 something of them are already gone. They've got to decide, are we building up or are we tearing down? Right? Are we going to try to suppress renewable energy, or are we going to focus on building up a geothermal industry, building up a nuclear industry, building transmission, welcoming large loads into the state, focusing on reducing energy waste, right? To make our grid more reliable, put money back in the pockets of Texans. They have a choice in front of them, and you can't do everything. You have to prioritize. So do you want to hurt an industry that has delivered a lot of value to the state, has significantly helped out, particularly with our summer peaks, which are very dangerous, and we've had energy emergencies multiple times over the last 10, 15 years, and now that's being alleviated. Do you want to push those down, or do you want to focus on actually building the grid of the future? That's the choice I think they have in front of them. I think it's an obvious choice, but obviously some people are making different choices.
No, I agree. I mean, I think it's I think we need to bring more and diverse sources of energy onto the grid, and keep the diversity we have already. That's what I think the answer is, Doug.
I'm with you, Ryan.
I think there's something about having these discussions too, and we mentioned this earlier in the week. I think as we're speaking to, and I'm just assuming that people on this call are mostly renewables people or in the industry or want to see it succeed. But I think when we're having these discussions, especially with policymakers and other folks who don't know as much about the industry or have heard stories about the industry that don't paint it favorably, I think it's really important to underscore and understand and communicate how much the renewables industry has enabled the oil and gas industry in Texas. I think there's a sense that there's kind of a talking point that if there are more renewables, it's going to be necessarily bad for oil and gas. And I don't think that's the case, especially on the production side, especially out in West Texas. And you get to make choices about how you want to electrify your operations. And I think it's important as often as possible, not only for us to advocate with our legislators, say, hey, this is a great industry for me and my family, but also to have oil and gas say, hey, this is a helpful complementary industry for our industry.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you are seeing that with the electrification in the Permian. Why do they want to electrify, right? Diesel generation in out in the oil patch is expensive. It's a very, very expensive way to make power. So they want to connect to the grid generally, but a lot of what is going to be powering fracking operations would be wind and solar because it's lower cost. To take it even further, Ryan, as you know, the geothermal industry has huge promise. There's so many promising companies in the Houston area. I know they're part of Real Houston and part of the whole ecosystem. They're part of, what the Greater Houston Partnership and the Houston Energy Transition Initiative is working on, right? Is having the skill set of oil and gas workers that translates into these clean tech industries like geothermal. Geothermal is drilling like that. That is what you're doing to create geothermal power. You're drilling into the earth. Like, the oil and gas industry knows how to do that. I'm interviewing later today for my podcast, Natura Resources. It's a good day doing that given HB 14 just dropped, but Doug Robinson, who is the CEO of Natura Resources that just got a construction permit, only the second one issued for a small modular reactor is going to be built. I believe it's under construction in Abilene. I'll know more after I talk to him today, but he's an oil and gas executive. He was head of an oil and gas company for decades. And so again, this is where we should be focused. This is what Texas should be all about, right? Is we're an energy state, right? We're not an oil and gas state. We're an energy state, all of the above. Let's go.
I believe that's a molten salt reactor, and it's
Yes,
on
it
the
is.
campus of Abilene
Yes, it
Christian
is.
University. It's pretty exciting, fun stuff.
I am not smart on that, but I will be much smarter in a couple hours. I'm looking
And
forward
can
to
you tell
talking
everybody
about
what's the name of your podcast, Doug?
Energy Capital Podcast.
Energy
Thanks for
Capital
asking.
Podcast. Absolutely. And there was one thing, I'm getting a few questions on this too. Do you happen to know, with regard to that transmission discussion that's happening tomorrow, how can folks access that?
You can typically watch those on, there's a website, I believe it's Admin Monitor. You can watch all the PUC hearings and meetings and workshops on there.
That's a PUC event.
It's a PUC meeting. That's right. Yeah,
Got it.
I believe staff will lead it. I don't think the commissioners are leading. It's a staff-led workshop. I'll try to grab this link and drop it in the chat for folks.
Perfect. Thanks for doing that.
Yeah.
So we've had a lot of questions in the Q&A. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but one did kind of jump out at me. So we're talking about transmission capacity is limited. We need to do a build out. Is there anything we can do in the interim to alleviate some of the stress? And I mean, and you talked about, we talk a lot about peak. We also talked about kind of baseline load usage, and the baseline is typically much lower than the peak, right? So there's a gap there and an opportunity to maybe do some arbitrage or somehow smooth things out when it gets lumpy and we start worrying about things like brownouts and blackouts.
So this is one of my favorite questions, and I appreciate it. Look, one of the things we absolutely need to do more of, and again, this is one of those things, like what does the legislature want to spend their time on? Flexible demand, right? Demand flexibility. Data centers themselves will have some of that, but there's so much flexible demand on the residential side, and we could be putting money into the pockets of Texas families and businesses by giving them the tools to exercise that flexible demand. Doesn't take anybody like staring at their phone or like paying attention to ERCOT prices. These are automated programs that, and some people will be like, I don't want to be involved in anything regarding my air conditioner. Fine. What about your electric hot water heater? What about your pool pump? Do you care when your pool pump runs? Would you take a $5 or $10 bill credit to have your pool pump run overnight instead of at 6 p.m. when the sun's going down? And we have very high prices on the grid. So flexible demand, and I do want to give credit. The legislature did pass Senate Bill 1699. I do believe, and I am not immune to this. We all sometimes give into negativity bias. We want to talk about SB 819 and we want to talk about SB 714. It's important we talk about those things, but it's also important to note that there have been good things done. And Senate Bill 1699, even in Senate Bill 2627, which created the Texas Energy Fund, there was $1.8 billion in funding for backup power packages at critical facilities. Those distributed resources closer to where load is used are a good thing to help us get through these years where we could see some more scarcity on the grid because there's rising load growth. So energy efficiency is a really big one. We've got to do that, especially to deal with our winter peaks. Inefficient heat is driving our winter peaks through the roof. And you could build gas plants till the cows come home. If you don't do something about the demand side, we're always going to be in a precarious situation in the wintertime. Add into that demand flexibility, moving demand around. Think of your electric vehicle. There's going to be more and more electric vehicles coming into the state, charging them like right now when the sun is high, power prices are probably zero. Your fuel is effectively free. And then don't charge at 6:30 as the sun's going down. You might even reverse the flow and feed into the grid at that time. Same with distributed energy resources, like solar and storage. And then just last thing, Ryan, just continuing what has happened, solar and storage continuing to come onto the grid, because what those developers are doing is looking for the places on the grid where they are able to connect, where they would not be required to curtail. They are looking for those kinds of sites. And that's why we're seeing development so diffuse around the state. So that in and of itself is another way to really deal with this kind of period while we're hopefully building towards things like geothermal and nuclear coming onto the grid.
So your point is we can kind of smooth out the demand where it meets the supply without constantly monitoring it ourselves, right? Like we can actually talk about AI. We can use AI to help us enable this activity.
There's 8,760 hours in the year. Well more than 8,000, probably more than 8,500 of them. There's no problem on the grid, right? Go to ERCOT.com and look at what's happening right now. Price is zero. And that is not most days, but I'd say we're into the hundreds of days now, well over 100, where in the middle of the day, the price is on the floor. We can take more demand. We just have to be able to deal with those peaks and increasingly the net peak. So that's that smoothing out you're talking about. You're exactly right.
So we got again, a lot of great questions on the Q&A. And one other one that jumps out to me is water and electricity. So what are your initial reactions there, Doug? I mean, I think to me, renewables have a lot of advantages there, right? And then you start talking about advanced nuclear and you have another twist that helps us deal with the water issue. But where's your mind on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the water energy nexus is so important. And don't forget that it's not just about electric generation and how much water those use, but of course, thermal. When we talk about thermal, we're talking about boiling water, right? So thermal power plants use a lot of water, but also the oil and gas industry uses a lot of water, right? So you end up with a lot of produced water that comes up in the oil and gas production process. And that is something that I know, again, I'm interviewing him today, but I was in prep for interviewing Doug Robinson of HBW Resources. This is something he talks a lot about, is that one of the things we could do with nuclear is that because there are a lot of hours out of the year where power is not expensive, you can use those hours to actually clean water, right? So it's desalination or it's just cleaning up produced water. So we need to think about the energy water nexus. Having an abundance of energy from all sources, including renewables, will help significantly with the water situation. And I don't think it's talked about nearly enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that desalination aspect of nuclear is extremely attractive and interesting.
Absolutely.
Let's see. We've got about 5 minutes here. Are you familiar with SB 388 relating
I
to the
am.
legislature's goal? You want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, it's better than it was last session. Last session, the same bill just said 50% of everything that gets built on the grid going forward must be natural gas. And now it says must be dispatchable. But in the discussion of the bill, when it was laid out, was that this week? I think it was was that Tuesday? Maybe it was last week, whatever it was. And time is a flat circle. I can't remember what day is what anymore. But whenever they had that discussion of Senate Bill 388, the author, Senator King, said he was asked about storage. Would it qualify? He said, well, but there's duration problems, so we'd have to like discount it. The problem with this is, we were talking about this earlier, the article in Heat Map News, the gas turbine crisis, right? If you are discounting storage and you're basically saying the only thing that's going to qualify for this is gas, and 50% of everything built has to be gas, now you're basically saying if you can't get a gas turbine, now you can't build anything else, or you're going to have to pay some massive penalty, which is going to slow down the development of additional resources. So again, I feel like there's just a whole, if you want to bring dispatchable power to the grid, there are so many different levers you could pull, but pull the ones like that actually help something get onto the grid, not push something else down, which is really what that bill would end up doing. There's other problems with 388. It puts the requirement on generation. So generators are paying other generators. I think that's going to have a huge, dampening effect on investment wanting to come into the state. Typically, if you have a credit kind of program, you put it on load serving entities. There's many, many, many problems with that bill. But the biggest one is 50%. Like, if with what's going on with gas turbines, you're going to take that, when Governor Abbott said in the State of the State address, in the last 4 years, our power supply has gone up 35%. If Senate Bill 388 passes, forget that for the next 4 years. It's not going up 35%. We'll be lucky if it goes up 3.5%. That's the problem with the bill like that.
And probably the same with HB 553 and SB 819 and all of these other bills that are fairly punitive to renewables build out.
That's right. That's right. And then we're back into the situation. Wasn't it nice in 2024 not having conservation alerts? Didn't people enjoy that? Wouldn't we like to keep that streak going, or do we want to get back into getting a conservation alert 14 times in a summer?
That's right. That's right. We have about 3 minutes left, Doug. So you mentioned the Energy Capital podcast. You mentioned you've got some really cool interviews coming up, like with Doug Robeson from Abilene Christian talking about advanced nuclear. Where else can we find your stuff?
Yeah, so DougLewin.com is the place to sign up for the Texas Energy and Power newsletter, get episodes of the Energy Capital podcast. I'm all the other places, LinkedIn, Twitter, Blue Sky, all that stuff, either Doug Lewin Energy or Doug Lewin. I'm pretty easy to find. But yeah, the main thing is I really do appreciate new subscribers. I'm trying to expand what I'm doing, bring in some additional writers and things like that, and cover things more. So any support you can provide there. I know not everybody can do a paid subscription, so I'm appreciative of all the subscribers, including the free ones. But if you can do a paid subscription, it really does help what I'm doing expand. But yeah, DougLewin.com. That's the place.
That's great. And this is, you found your way here, so you're probably familiar with Renewable Energy Alliance and our website. If you want to find out about more real events, LinkedIn's probably the easiest way to stay up to date there. So find us on LinkedIn with Real Houston. But Doug, this has been awesome. Sorry for folks who didn't get to all your questions, but I think we shared a lot of knowledge, and hopefully folks walk away feeling that they're better informed than when they join the conversation.
Yeah, send me the questions after. I'm probably overdue for like a mailbag episode of my podcast anyway. So maybe I'll answer some of those in a future episode. And Ryan, thanks for the great questions, great conversation. And Kay and everybody at Real Houston, thanks for doing this, and thanks for all you do.
Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.